Good. So, I had a tough time. I have to be honest with you, trying to do this one. I um trying to find one. I mean, they're all great, every one of them. And for some reason, this one just spoke to me. And I'm trying to figure out. I said to Phil, I said, where were we January 2020 and February 2020? And I know, we had moved here, our place, in August of 2019. And some of you already know that when we went to meet Elaine and the SAC Fellowship back in April of 2019 and met many of you, this whole thing was a was a different language to me. At that camp meeting, just I think I was just there and taking it all in, and um, just overwhelmed, but at the same time excited that God is leading us in this way. And I know Phil was very much excited about this. And but specifically in January and February of 2020, I think I had gotten a bad case of poison oak. We were, and I had never been, you know, um, I had never been exposed to poison oak, let alone thought I was allergic. So around this time, I think I couldn't even really focus on a lot of things. So I said, where was this one? And although this is a review and it's been repeated so many times, it was just really nice to go back and say, okay, let me just take it all in. But instead of me presenting it, I like to go ahead and just read off with your permission to go ahead and just the way it was laid out. And thank you for Elaine for putting this already from the beginning. So there are form lines. We know how to behave based upon where we are in their form lines. And I think that spoke to me a lot. And I think when we know where we're at and where we know where we're headed and where our, it tells us how to be behaving. So and I know that's been said more than once in many of Elder Tessa's presentations, that where we are in the reform line gives us the foundation and the surety of where we're headed. But when this was written and when this was presented in February 7th, 2020, 4 to 5 months prior was the split that had happened. And I remember when that happened around August 2029, September, was also about the time that, again, we had moved here. And then our daughter and her family moved to Ecuador. Then we went to Ecuador with them for visit. So a lot was going on. And I really wasn't understanding so much what was happening with Elder Jeff and all that, except for the fact that we need to stay where we're at. We can't go off, going on the other one. So when that split happened, what Elder Tess was saying is everyone would have been safe from it if they knew where they were on the reform line and what to expect. The split occurred because we did not have a common understanding of where we were at their form lines. And if they had seen where we were either on the line of the priests or the line of the 144,000, there would have been no shaking and everyone would have been safe. So Elder Tess wants these presentations that we are safe only as we know where we are in the reform line and how to behave. And we were not safe prior to November 9th. Elder Primender has been covering that subject, and those that leave in the Sunday law history were in grave danger between August and November of last year. And she wanted to make the claim that we're in grave danger today. She was saying that then and saying that now. And the people who do not understand where we are in the reform line, who don't trust in those reform lines, are telling us that we're in the same degree of danger as we are now, what we were in August and September of last year. If we were to go back under reform line to 144,000, it begins again in 1989. There's the increase of knowledge in 1991, and then 1996, the formalization. Then we come to the test of 2001 and 9/11. That's the first dispensation. And it's the dispensation of the plowing, and the plowing of the 144,000. And we come down to the Sunday law history, close of probation, and the second advent. And it's well established now, with repeating that pattern is going to increase the knowledge, and that we'll formalize it the loud cry. So that the repeating pattern is well established in the plowing history of the latter rain history. We understand that the repeating pattern also occurs in the early rain and the harvest. When it comes to the line of the priest, we have the same history of plowing as the 144,000, and we're plowed from 1989 to 2001 and 9/11. The early rain is from the 2001, 9/11 to 2014. It's going to be another increase of knowledge in 2009, or the 2520, and then in 2012, the time setting. Then in the 2014, there begins our latter rain. The reform line of the priest is just the same pattern fractalized as 144,000. So we find our midnight cry in the history of the latter rain. There's also an increase of knowledge in 2016, and it's formalized in 2018 and shut door in 2019. And now we're in the period of the harvest until Panium 2021. This is the line of the 144,000, top line, and then the line of the priest, fractalized in the bottom line. So we take this line, or really the whole line, the whole history of the end of modern Israel, we compare and contrast it to the end of ancient Israel. When we do that, we come to this history where we go to the world. And then what is that waymark? That is 34 AD. And then they go to the Gentiles. What Elder Tess says is she finds this astonishing that for the most part of Adventism, they have no concept of the history prior to the Sunday law and what leads to it. But yet the entire gospel, the history of the gospels and the first part of Acts are all about the history that leads to the Sunday law. It's all about God preparing Israel to go to the Gentiles. So we have this great wealth of information to explain to us the time of the end to the Sunday law history. And when we do this, we understand that it's to the world from 34 AD, or the Sunday law. And prior to that, God is going to sort out Israel, ancient and modern, in 2 steps. First to the disciples, and they come to the test, which is a cross. And they've been trained under John, and then trained under Jesus, then tested. And the cross lines up with its primary sense with November 9th, 2019. And I know that October of 2019, the second camp meeting that was held at Rescue, that was when, I know, well, going back, April of 2019 was when there was the baptism. About 3/4 of the people that I remember attended that camp meeting were baptized. And then in October of 2019, Belle and I were baptized, as well as others that were there. And I remember I didn't quite understand at that time what November 9th meant, except that I knew that I needed to take a stand before that November 9th came. So going back with the study. So repeating the points that we began with, we understand that alone, if we had just agreed on that point, alone there could have been no split for that last year. They had agreed that we must have an increase of knowledge on the Sunday law, and at the cross was this waymark. We're not going to go through that history of the end of ancient Israel, but everyone knows how strong that is if we've seen someone present that logic. We look
You
at the
know,
history.
huh?
Go
Oh, I'm
ahead.
sorry. I appreciate what you just shared, that you didn't um, uh, uh, understand or grasp the full meaning of what the close of probation meant for us on that priest line, but you felt its importance. And I think maybe all of us can relate to that in all parts of this message. Sometimes we don't, we get some of it, but we can't completely grasp, just like patriarchy. I got what was meant by it in its original presentation, but not like we're coming to see. You know what I mean? Like things are so
Exactly.
much deeper than
Exactly.
we initially understand. But God's so patient with us if we keep that open heart, you know,
Amen.
we do learn
Mhm.
more.
And I know for me, and Fel knows this very well, that I can only get what I can get. And if I get, I mean, how do I explain it? Before, before going to the 2019 camp meeting in April, I hadn't even heard of Jeff Parmenter. I hadn't even heard of anything. I was very much into our, you know, um, going our Sabbath Adventist, our Antioch church. We've been since we moved from Southern California in 1985. Well, no, excuse me. We moved from Southern California in 1985, but didn't start attending the local church until 87, 88, but 89, thereabouts. And 91, it was when Fel and I were baptized together. And it was a community. You know, we had young children to raise, and it was family, and that was all I knew. And but Fel, had always searched, as if you've heard him, and he would, share with me things. And um, but I think every once in a while when I did hear him listen to Elder Parmity again, it was, I mean, Elder Parmity, Elder Jeff, it was a different language. I just couldn't understand it. And when actually saw him present in April again, it's like I just was just overwhelmed. But I think just like you said, open heart, studying, staying, accepting, and knowing that this is a line of success. This is where God is leading us.
Amen.
So we look at the history where the first angel passes the mantle to the second angel, 2024, excuse me, 2014, should be 2014. We line it up at 9/11 with baptism. So at the time of the end, we have the birth of Jesus, the birth of John first, and the birth of Jesus, both arriving at the same point in time. You have the first angel, John, who does his work, and then you have the second angel, Jesus, who's at his baptism, but he's not yet taking over that leadership. And we say this time is not, he says his time has not yet come. He goes into the wilderness, marriage of Cana, and then the first temple cleansing, and it transitions from John to Christ all the way to the cross. There are some points here. Again, both leaders exist together at the time of the end. One is just going to stay in obscurity until his time has come. That's the first point to remember. The second point is there's always this transition from the first to the second. So you have both at the time at the end, then the transition comes always at the middle of the way mark, from the first leader to the second leader. And then the third point um, has to do with the understanding the nature of the kingdom. We know that John didn't understand it, but we know Jesus did. And he's going to try to teach that through parable methodology. Now, Ellen White tells us that John has this problem. He doesn't understand the nature of the kingdom. Um, Parable after parable. Matthew 13, so many other parables in the Gospels, Jesus repeatedly says, the kingdom of heaven is like. And he's trying to teach them what John had done wrong, had wrong. And when you get down to the history of Gethsemane and the cross, the disciples are tested and the movement is tested. The Pharisees, they've already been rejected. It's the movement and those who claim to believe it that are tested. And all those who failed that test had not been able to transition from the teaching of the first leader. So they had the 3 points to remember is both arrive at the time of the end. They transition at the first temple cleansing, the middle way mark, and then they work through Jesus and the work of Jesus through parables is to help people learn what the first angel had wrong. We know that Jesus understands the nature of the kingdom. He there's no mistake. What is it? Yes, in his message, he does not have a mistake about the nature. He does not have a mistake of the nature of the kingdom. Remember that point, because people who did not understand our reform lines, do not put their faith in them, are starting to share the thoughts that in the history of our latter rain and the harvest of this movement has all those errors about the nature of the kingdom. These are the complex arguments between FFA and ourselves, but just accepting the reform line should have been enough for people. We're in the same position today, just understanding that point alone. So in April of 2019, the first time Elder Jeff came to publicly attack the Midnight Cry message, he didn't do it openly. Oh, where did I just go? Did I just read that? Am I number 8? Yeah. Sorry about that. So, so in April 2019, the first time Elder Jeff began to publicly attack the Midnight Cry message. He didn't do it openly. He began by attacking the message of 2012. The conclusion of his study in 2012 would have undermined the Midnight Cry message. And his whole point was that the second angel is half right and half wrong, that Miller was half right and half wrong. Samuel Snow was half right and half wrong. He didn't go to the history of the Christ because he couldn't. So he went to 2018, he went to 1888. We have 1844, and then we have 1888. And he said that the second angel is half right and half wrong. In 1888, he says that Wagner is half right and half wrong, and he applied them to the second angel and said that Elder Parminder is half right and half wrong. The conclusion of that is both Elder Parminder and Elder Tess do not understand the nature of the kingdom. But that was presented in April of 2019, and Elder Tess and Elder Parminder immediately put a stop to that study. They presented the logic that they had already been part of in the 2018 message. They went to the history of Pyrrhus, Macedonia, and Italy, and World War II, and then World War III. They looked at the concluding scenes of those history, and they found that in our history, this war, that we marked at the end of Paneum with the victory of the King of the North. So when you go to World War II, and it concluded in 1945 with the victory of the King of the South. In Italy, the victory of that was Rome, King of the North. In Macedonia, it was King of the South. Prior to the victory of the King of the North at Paneum, there were 2 major battles, 2018 and 2019. Both were won by King of the South. And prior to 1945, there were 2 battles. Those won were won by the King of the North. And prior to the battle, final battle of Italy, the Pyrrhic War, there were two battles, and they were won by King of the South. And prior to the end of the Macedonian War, there were two battles won by the King of the North. So they were able to present a firm logic and multiple witnesses showing the Alpha and Omega history. First, the history of Pyrrhus. Second, the first history of Pyrrhus and the second history of Pyrrhus in the Alpha history, and the King of the South wins. And in the Omega, the King of the North wins. So you can switch each battle of this history. So when you're looking at it from a perspective of the counterfeit, this counterfeit King of the North and Alpha history is failure. The King of the North fails in an Alpha history and wins in the Omega history. We have two witnesses in this diagram, and then we also prove it in the line of the beginning of the modern Babylon, the papacy and the history of the world wars. Combined, that becomes three witnesses that in an Alpha history, the King of the North fails, and in the Omega history, it's victorious. We recognize that when we come to 1844 and 1888, all of this is an Alpha history, two losses and then a victory. There were two losses, and then when we get to the history of the 144,000, we have the victory. 1844 was a defeat, 1888 was a defeat, and the line of 144,000 a success, because this is all Omega, the history of success. Back in April of 2019, we're presenting this logic, but just as you cannot go to the history of World War II to see the history of King of the North complete its mission, you cannot go to the Alpha history of modern Israel, the true King of the North, and see the second angel complete its mission. Samuel Snow had mistakes, Wagner had mistakes, but that's because they were both in the Alpha history, and that's failure. You cannot you cannot drop a history of failure on top of a history of success without taking into account that modification. And it's the same with a true King of the North. You can't drop Millerite history straight into our own without making some modifications. But what makes this history successful is that the movement unlearns the mistakes of the first angel, and that's the difference between failure and success. In the history of Christ, which is a history of success, it's an Omega history. John does not understand the nature of the kingdom, but then Jesus comes and he understands the nature of the kingdom and he's able to explain it. When you come to the Millerite history, Alpha, failure, Miller is in his message, does not understand the nature of the kingdom, and it transitions to Snow, and he too doesn't fix a mistake. He's expecting Christ to come in October 22nd, just like everyone else. So at the beginning, they start the same. And Elder Tress wants to note that the beginning of these wars is the same. You don't start switching things in the beginning. Alpha and Omega, they all start with the exact same pattern. Then you get halfway through and you have to switch, whether it's a line of Moses, the beginning of ancient Israel, or the end of ancient Israel, the beginning of modern Israel, or the end of modern Israel. They all start the same pattern. They start the same way. The first angel is always mistaken about the nature of the kingdom. Moses, John, Miller, and Jeff, but they all misunderstand the nature of the kingdom. Then you get halfway through and you make that switch, whether it's the line of Moses in the beginning of ancient Israel, the end of ancient Israel, the beginning of modern Israel, and the end of modern Israel, they all start with the same pattern. The first angel is always mistaken about the nature of the kingdom. Moses, John, Miller, and Jeff. They misunderstand the nature of the kingdom. So the reform lines have the same pattern. Um, they then, just like the King of the North in its Alpha and Omega histories, you come to the history of the second leader, and you have to take into account the dynamic of success and failure, the Alpha and Omega. The first angel does not understand the nature of the kingdom, and Moses thinks he needs to take it by force, by fighting, and John thinks it's this earthly empire, and Miller thinks that the earth is the sanctuary. So our reformed lines start the same way, whether they're Alpha or Omega. Then we come to the arrival of the second leader in the history of success, the Omega, to find those mistakes corrected. Jesus is able to correct their understanding. He has the right message. He has the perfect message. Then you come to Miller. Samuel Snow corrects nothing, so it becomes a history of failure. Then we come to our history, success. So you just like the end of the ancient Israel, this second half of our reform line from 2014 forward, we must see a correction of mistakes of the first messenger. The reason the elder test labors this point is so we have it embedded in our minds, it's refreshed. People struggling in this movement about what the nature of the kingdom looks like, they're coming to the conclusions that Elder Parminder and Elder Tess, and all those who would want to sign their name on this, the nature of the kingdom that we've been teaching, the history of the Midnight Cry, into this time period of harvest is incorrect. But there were mistakes with Elder Jeff's model and with our model. Then we come to our history, its success. Just like the end of ancient Israel, there's a correction of the mistakes of the first messenger. Sorry, I just did that one. Yeah, hold on. So Elder Tess was wanting to warn us that we're stepping away from our reform lines and we're beginning to use the same methodologies FFA was using when they started to leave the movement, and that we're following the same track of thinking that we're also going to leave this movement, but that we should understand the nature of the kingdom. I just wanted to come back from it. We've talked about the history and the line of the priest, and she talked about the line of the Millerites. That October 22nd was really not the final close of probation for that history. Because in 1850, they actually were going back to work. Oh, where'd it go? If they're going back to work in 1850, they haven't closed their probation. They haven't reached the Daniel 12:1. So if you understand that October 22nd is a shut door for a fractal, that shouldn't need proving. It should just make sense. They go to the world in 1850, and so you know that October 22nd is not Daniel 12:2 on that reform line instead, except 12:1, excuse me, for that reform line. Instead, oops, where did I go? Instead, it lines up with a test for the first group. So they go through 1798, their time of the end, and they go through the tarrying time. Then we mark that as 1840, and also April 19th. Then we go to Boston of 2014, which is July 21st for them in that line. Concord, which I believe is August 1. And then Exeter, that's August 15. And the primary application of October 22nd is November 9th for last year. There's a first group that were called out of the Protestant churches. They're trained under Miller, and then they're trained under Snow. And they've been through the tarrying time, and then they face October 22nd, the test. That's for that group of people. October 22nd, they face a disappointment. And we know that they go back to work in 1850, and October 22nd is a fractal. It's not the final close of probation for that period. So now Elder Tess wanted us to kind of go back and see how during the 1260, during the work, how God has prepared the time for us to be where things need to be. So within that time period, there's the Protestant Reformation. And then what did and God gave during the Protestant Reformation? He had a message that he needed to spread, God did. And they had a message and they needed a mechanism to share it. And what was that mechanism? It was a printing press. We know that the printing press was around 1440 AD. And then at 1450 is when the Bible was printed. And the Protestant Reformation was in the 1500s, 1517 to 1648. So fast forward to Millerite history, there was a message that needed to be transmitted. And just like in the Protestant Reformation, God is going to give them a mechanism to transmit that message. And so with 1798, we had gas was used for lighting. She mentioned about vaccines, but she wants to also just focus on how the gospel was spread. So gas was used for the lighting. Then 10 years later, the steamboats. So the boats, they were able to travel up and down the rivers. In 1811, they were able to run the printing press off of steam. Then for most of in 1825, there were the passenger cars and train cars. And for the first time, people could travel freely by train. In 1837, you've got the telegraph, and it's invented and it spreads for the first message in 1844. And this first message ever shared by telegraph and what was written is, what had God wrought, which is what had God done. So from the end of 1260, God had a message developing God has a message developing that needs to be spread rapidly to the world. Specifically in this history, every corner of the United States, and people have traveled by wagon. Back then it was horsepower. So then a few years before Miller needs to begin his public teaching, you find that the train system began to set up. And by that time, you get to 1844. And in Joseph Bates, the autobiography of Joseph Bates, he writes that he was on his way to, that there were cars. And you can go to other quotes to see how Miller used the train systems. And Joseph Bates says, is traveling to Exeter on a train. And his thoughts were, quote, you're going to have a new light in Exeter. He talks about the Exeter camp meeting. He said that the hills ring with a midnight cry. And he says that the wagons, that he would be drawn by horses, and the stages also by horses, and the railroad cars rode through all different states, and the cry resounded, and the cry was spread. He says that in the second quote that the midnight cry flew as if it was wings on the wind, men and women moving in all points of the compass, going with all the speed of locomotives, steamboats, and rail cars, carrying books and papers, distributing them as the flying leaves of autumn. When it comes to the history of midnight cry, it spreads as on the wings of the wind because of the technology God raised in that time period. And that's the way Ellen White traveled at that time as well. That gave the Millerite the ability to rapidly spread the three angels' message. So I understand it's 12:30. If it's okay with everyone, there's about 17 more slides. Could I go ahead and continue?
I'm good if everyone else is.
I'm good.
I'm good.
Thank you.
I'm good.
Thank you. So in the again, the Protestant Reformation, God gives a printing press. Millerites are able to travel in passenger cars. So now, fast forward to us. We come to the history of the 144,000. What do we have? We have the World Wide Web. So it's just amazing how we talked about during our, the pandemic, how this was already in place. The Zoom mechanism to be able to still gather,
Wow.
3+ times a week. It's just amazing how
Yes.
God just laid it all out and we just step into it firmly.
Yes.
But at the same time, we know that we use it for our, the spreading and the sharing. But we know that the World Wide Web is used for so many other things, as we've been already discussing in our other meetings. We've got, Google, we've got YouTube, we've got every imaginable ways to gather and to share. So we come back, we go to the history of 1996. We know that we find two information streams. Of course, there's CNN, and we've got Fox. And we've spoken all about these information streams, but there's advancements in technologies that can benefit, that we can all benefit from. That would very quickly, these two opposing sides harness that engine. And we find that CNN, which tends to have either a mainstream or liberal bent, it'll be transmitting news. So we'll see also that Fox News transmits their news. And that's a propaganda machine of America's dictator. So these machines don't just benefit God's people. We wanted to consider why we find them at the time of the end, because we can tend to think that these media streams are all for the benefit of the world, the Nethinims. But 1996 is not anywhere near the line of the world. Instead, it's in our reform line. So you have 1989 and 2001, and in 1996, we have the formalization of the message, and internally we have the Time of the End magazine, and those two entities externally is that we've got the CNN and Fox. And then you've got, again, 2001, 2014, 2019, 2021. And in the line of the world doesn't really begin until 2014. But right back in our reform line, there's a couple of people that we need to pay attention to. And we've already mentioned several times about Jerry Falwell, but specifically, we have Michael Moore, and then we have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. He begins, so Michael Moore begins to spread his message, his life calling in 1989. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was born in October 13, 1989. So we've got these personalities, and then we've also got these streams of information. And then we mark the Jerry Falwell, the apostate Protestantism, and we have Michael Moore and Alexandria AOC, her liberal and the liberal opposition. And Elder Tess wants to note that all these people connect to the time of the end of 444,000, so they're relevant to us. If we want to be part of the 144,000, they're not distant characters, only relevant to the world or to the Nethinims. It becomes our responsibility to know who they are and how we identify with them. Let me see here. Next one. So she wanted to just recap that we did in line 144,000. We have the 4 dispensations, the 5 key waymarks, 1989, 2001, the Sunday Law, close of probation, and Second Advent. And we identified that the Sunday Law connects to the 34 AD and that the spreading of the message to the world. And by this time, God has sorted out his church. Then we left that subject and we went to this first group, and I wanted to relate it both to the Millerite reform line and to the line of Christ. And we built the four dispensations. This is the line of the priests. And that Christ, in the history of Christ, twice Christ goes to the church, Israel, and then goes to the Gentiles. So for the first time, he takes a group out of the church, and they're known as the disciples, and they go through the history of training under the first and then the second messenger. At the end of the training of the second messenger, they face a test of the cross. And to pass that test, they had to have learned one important thing. They're not following the first. They've come to be the followers of the second. And if they have not learned that, they leave as did Judas before the cross. Just as Elder Primate has discussed in his Sunday Law history, the many that leave. So the cross is the first time God reaches into Israel and pulls out people. He's going to go to do the same at Pentecost.
So you had to accept the transition of leadership
Transition. Exactly.
that had already taken
Taken
place or was did not happen as it was supposed to, because he didn't leave initially.
Correct. So we wanted to remember three things. The first was that there's the first and second messengers. They arrive at the same point at the time of the end. And you have the arrival of the second of the baptism, but Jesus' time is not to take over the ministry until the baptism time with the first temple cleansing. And then Jesus is going to teach through the parables. And at that point, the disciples need to learn is that while John plowed them and he trained them, but that John did not understand, John is the first messenger to understand the nature of the kingdom. But John taught that his kingdom was the earthly empire, and Judas died because he believed that John's message over Christ's message, and that's where he failed. Some of the disciples may have been confused, and there were things that came as a shock to them, but Ellen White tells them that at the cross, they loved Jesus more than ever before. Their loyalty at that level could not be shaken. So the two leaders both exist from the time of the end, and the second arrives, then the second takes over, and the second is going to teach them the pure, true nature of the kingdom. Then they're tested based on whether or not they have understood and accepted that message at the shut door of the cross. This just goes again, the reviewing of the difference between the history of failure and the history of success. And that the King of the North and the King of the South, they make their switch. So let's, this last one here. So in the history of 1844 and 1888, in our Omega history of the King of the North, even if you can mark it so just like the Omega history of the King of the North, even here you can mark failure, fair, success, which is the 1844 failure, 1888 failure, and then 144,000 success. So if you wanted to take this one line of Adventism from 1798 to the second Advent, you still find failure, fail, success. When you make that change from a history of failure to a history of success as evidenced by Christ with three other witnesses, this witness and that witness, the counterfeit of the papacy and the history of Christ, four witnesses that all demonstrate that in the time period of the second messenger, they understand correctly the nature of the kingdom, and they're not going to have a prophetic disappointment because they're not a mistake in that message. So Elder Jeff attacked that, and at the beginning, We were at the time period of danger before November 9th, Gethsemane and the cross. We're in a time period of danger today. We're in the wilderness and the wilderness of temptation. Just as we are in the danger of before November 9th, you can't take your eyes off the lines. We're in danger now. So no one needed to leave the movement last year, referring to 2019. No one would have left the movement last year if they had any faith in the basic reform line and in the Midnight Cry, which taught in the history of success. The people today are struggling with the same concepts that Elder Jeff shared. They would not side with him. They could not side with him. But they don't realize that they're using this exact logic, which is divorced from reform lines, and attempting to teach them that there are mistakes in the history of the second angel in the line of success. That's where Elder Jeff began, and we all know where he ended. So Elder Tess wanted to send a warning to the people, meant in love, that if we're using the same methodology and we're just trusting the lines and we're refusing to trust them, that we're buying the same argument that Elder Jeff made. And you might do it over different doctrines, but you're following the same exact path. If everyone can see, just as was taught last April, the difference between a history of failure and a history of success, we could have the beginning of a surety of where we are and where we need to understand. Let me go ahead and just close by reading the prayer that Elder Tess had shared at that presentation. Dear Lord, thank you for our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that you do not leave us having to doubt. We know where we are. Lord, you have given us abundant proof of the truthfulness of this message. Lord, everyone of us could fall away, could leave, and yet this movement will go on to success with or without us. I pray for every head bowed, Lord, that would be with us. I pray for every head bowed, Lord, that would be with us, for our brethren that are struggling, that these messages that are distrusting the lines, following the lines are of different creed. I pray, Lord, that they will see their danger in time, that they will realize that we mean only love, that we do not want to be separated from them as we have been from other brethren, that we also love over these last months. Lord, we do not desire the shaking, but we also know that this movement can only be successful as we keep the truth. We could only be part of that success as we individually keep the truth. I pray, Lord, that you be with us and strengthen us in your faith. In Jesus' name, amen.